The last of the theorists that we'll be discussing in this recorded lecture is Pierre Bourdieu. He was a French philosopher, anthropologist who had done some field work in Africa, as well as a sociologist. He was interested in the movement and transmission and as well as maintenance of power over time within society. He was a public intellectual in much the same line as Noam Chomsky. However, unlike Chomsky, his academic work is much more aligned with his activist work. He rallies against the overall expansion of wealthy capitalist powers in what he believed to be a variety of guises for essentially the expansion of wealthy capitalist powers in the context of neoliberalism, free trade, and globalization. And one of the places that this comes out is in his 1998 book, Active Resistance Against the Tyranny of the Market. For Bourdieu, there is a focus on the material aspect of the world, much more so than many of the other postmodernists, and also he believes the possibility of a scientific anthropology. Nevertheless, he couches this possibility of a scientific anthropology in the context of an analysis of subjective experiences and dispositions as keys to understanding society as a whole. One of his major works that is not very much discussed in McGee and Worms is Distinction, a Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste in 1984. In this piece, Bourdieu notes that judgments of taste are related to social position. And he seeks within distinction to reconcile the influences of both external social structures and subjective experiences on the individual. So the idea of structure as well as agency, which of course is a very old debate in the context of social sciences, anthropology, and the human condition more generally. In Distinction, Bourdieu discusses class fractions and how these teach their youth different aesthetic preferences. They are determined by various degrees of social, economic, and cultural capital. And for Bourdieu, a key concept of his is capital along these three lines: social, economic, and cultural. For Bourdieu, society incorporates symbolic goods, especially those regarded as attributes of excellence, as the ideal weapon in strategies of distinction. One has to take account of all the characteristics of social condition which are statistically associated from earliest childhood with possession of high or low income, and which tend to shape taste adjusted to these conditions. Each fraction of the dominant class will in turn develop its own aesthetic criteria. A multitude of consumer interests based on differing social positions necessitates that each fraction for Bourdieu has its own artists and philosophers, newspapers and critics, just as it has its own hairdresser, tailor, and interior decorator. The work that's discussed in McGee and Worms is one of his key works. Also, in 1980, he produced The Logic of Practice. And he talks about a number of concepts. I'm going to highlight two of these here, the notion of habitus and the idea of capital. These were, in this piece, introduced, and then they were applied to the matrimonial strategies and kinship of a North African group based on his fieldwork in the 1950s. For Bourdieu, the notion of habitus is a system of durable and transposable dispositions through which we perceive, judge, and act in the world. Habitus is not universal. Rather, it is a characteristic of a specific individual or group, as discussed along the lines of class fraction, place, and time. So it's particularistic rather than individual. For Bourdieu, capital maintains three forms, not just the capital of economics or financial capital, much of the discussion of Karl Marx, but we also see here cultural and social capital, which of course he develops in his later work in 1984 on distinction. Capital for Bourdieu is any resource that allows one access to position and the ability to benefit within any field. This is another key concept of Bourdieu. the field is composed of, the fields essentially compose social space taken in total. They are microcosms with their own rules, regularities, and forms of authority. So what the postmodernists challenge and lay out for anthropologists is a real chinks in the armor, shall we say, to the idea that an objective anthropology is possible. And beyond that, whether objectivity is possible in and of itself in any sort of paradigm. Again, Lyotard talks about this in the context of meta-narratives in science as a whole. And so we've seen many works that have emerged during and through this time in science and technology studies, STS, some of the work of later scholars examining the interface of laboratory cultures, laboratory cultures such as Bruno Latour. We also see Laura Nader's contribution to this in her book, her edited volume, Edited Science, where amongst the things under consideration are the production of nuclear weapons and how they are discussed in scientific terms, or the difference between lay discourses of scientific knowledge as well as scientific discourses of scientific knowledge, and of course the disconnect between science and policy in the United States, and the development and recent emergence of a whole field of scientific literature. That is, how is all of this information going to be translatable between various actors? And we see this in some of the discussions concerning climate change, with the fact that what the American public as a whole knows about climate change, or what influences them in the scientific literature, is very marginal in terms of its actual impact on the public as a whole, who tend to rely more on things like elite cues to designate particular moments or the particular importance of processes in global climate change. We also, and specifically what contributes to that, or the earlier discussion of that from Laura Nader, is this idea of literacy as a whole, suggesting that at least in terms of translation between different types of knowledge and transmission of information and sharing of knowledge, that science in and of itself needs to build its capacity, and scientists need to build their capacity to convey their ideas to broader publics, because of course the readership of journals in science, the journal Science, is rather limited in the US population as a whole. Foucault and others bring up the connections between the production of knowledge and power, and that particular knowledge has come into existence at particular times, and essentially the resources that are drawn from to create particular knowledges at particular times. For example, individuals that have been critical of the development of industry have, in the United States, have noted the close connections between technological development and military applications as a whole. And again, the work of Gusterson and looking at the building of atomic bombs and how these are discussed are part of this overall. But essentially, who is doing the research? What position do they occupy? There's been, of course, within the scientific literature, where within submitting for publication, one has to disclose any potential conflict of interest, and these are perhaps many in the context of even research institutions which have some dollars which are associated with particular research paradigms, whether this be in agriculture or defense. So it calls into question overall the scientific endeavor, and whether individuals are necessarily starting from a neutral position as a whole. And this again extends not only to the context of anthropology, but in other disciplines as well. We've highlighted over the course of the semester scholars, individuals in anthropology and outside that have contributed. How much of what they are doing would they say is scientific, in the sense that they are following the scientific method, despite what they might allege. how much of it actually is scientific in the sense of following the rigor of the scientific method of creating experiments with hypotheses and isolating variables which are in fact testable. At the same time, that we might look at interpretation in the context of material of culture in the context of its symbolic approaches and symbolic and interpretive anthropology. This discussion can also be brought out to our archaeology, and indeed much of what archaeology knows is based on interpretation, and how much of that interpretation, as the postmodernists allege, is filtered through particular ways of understanding the world as a whole. And so in another thing to consider, are these false binaries? Are these in fact, are these reconcilable in any sort of meaningful way as anthropologists move forward over the next 50 or 100 years? Certainly the postmodern critique has been incorporated into much anthropological work, even the work of individuals that would identify themselves as doing ethnosemantics, ethnoscientific type of work as a starting point or base to explore larger questions of power in the field and rhetoric and writing styles and whatnot. And so I'm, of course, very curious to hear your thoughts on this as we continue our class discussions and work towards the production of a particular type of knowledge in the context of the final exam as a whole. So again, by means of review, the postmodernists were influenced through multiple areas, both within and outside of anthropology, and not only academic disciplines, but also the times within which they were living through, because these were rather dramatic times. And of course, Clifford Geertz has noted that we are living in interesting times, and may we all live in interesting times. And the political upheavals in France in particular certainly tinged the experience of these French scholars and their positioning overall and looking at social systems from a postmodernist and post-structuralist perspective. I compared and contrasted the modernist perspective and the postmodernist perspective, highlighted some of the contributions of the postmodernist, again, broadly influential within anthropology, in the incorporation of the critique, even where the scientific method is being followed, being more explicit about methods. And so this produces, as McGee and Worms note, the potential irony that, in fact, it makes ethnography more scientific. However, taken to its logical extreme, we see that postmodernism can be very inward-looking and potentially result in navel-gazing, as well as potentially be used as a justification to hear all voices rather than express truth to power in an activist sense within anthropology. And indeed, this raises interesting questions about what anthropology should be used for and how it should be used, whether it should be just merely an academic endeavor, and whether an academic endeavor is truly necessary, or is it even possible, regardless of whether it's desirable or not. Would the postmodernists say that a truly that these are truly academic exercises? Certainly, with their discussions of going from Derrida, the notion of licensing and delicensing and the production of texts, these are not objective, these are not neutral, and they can never necessarily be neutral as a whole. So this raises, I think, interesting questions in looking at the discipline of anthropology in the context of the applied focus in anthropology, applied anthropology, as well as academic anthropology, and whether anthropology is or should be a four-field approach or a five-field approach, incorporating the work of applied anthropologists as they are doing work in each one of the disciplines. That is all anthropology necessarily applied anthropology in one sense of the word, in one sense of the word or the other, irregardless of the anthropologist's intention, which of course goes back to the whole discussion about art by intention versus art by appropriation. And is what we are producing in our ethnographies art, science, or some complex mix of the two? So I hope I've given you much to think about in the context of postmodernism and anthropological theory in this series of 3 recorded lectures.